Listening to stories of the night, I am about to share a chapter of my life that continues to affect my family. My old primary school classmates still talk about it. Even though I lost contact with all of them, not long ago at a reunion someone I didn't know asked if I was the child to whom everything had happened. My family insists that much of what I'm about to tell didn't happen, that it's a product of my imagination, a way for my brain to cope with the trauma. Still, I'm sure many who have lived around here will recognize the legends and even the characters I am about to mention. I remember everything perfectly, as if it were yesterday, just weeks before my catechism ended or I made my first communion. Carlos, my brother who is 3 years older than me, had not made his first communion. For some reason he always refused and never wanted to tell my mother why. Therefore, my making it became almost an obsession for her. The first times I went to catechism, she was so devoted that she herself would take me and stay around, helping in the church and looking after Mari Carmen, my little sister, who was 3 years old at the time, until I finished. Yes, I couldn't tell my mother that I didn't want to be a man, but I wanted to be a man. However, after a few times, Mari Carmen began to cry as soon as we approached the church, located on a steep hill in the Huaycura neighborhood of Tijuana. She said she was scared of the women in black, referring, we thought, to the nuns who lived in the convent next to the church. So, much to her regret, she let me go alone then, accompanied by a boy, Diego, who lived 2 streets away and whose father always brought him. However, only one occasion after that did he accompany us, and then Diego and I began our journey to the church, to each catechism, alone. There was something strange about those days. Perhaps there weren't as many people in the neighborhood as there are today, but still, I remember those walks we took through what seemed like a deserted neighborhood, where only the strangest inhabitants dared to venture out. On one occasion we left the church late. Well, not too late, but enough for it to start getting dark, and were eager to get home. Instead of taking the main street down, we chose one of the side streets. It was much more solitary, but the path was shorter. We passed by the primary school a few blocks from the church, and a sound coming from inside caught our attention. What is that? 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 Hearing something at that hour in a deserted school was unsettling. My first instinct was to run, but after a few meters I realized Diego was not running beside me. I stopped. Diego was peering over the fence, looking into the school towards the 6th grade classrooms, very close to the exit. I went back slowly and asked him what he was seeing, whispering. He answered in the same hushed tone, "Be quiet. We'll see us." Then I saw what he meant. Inside the classroom, 3 meters from the school fence, dimly lit by the street lamp, was the figure, the silhouette, of a nun looking out. Motionless. Eerie. I started running again, this time much faster, as fast as my extra weight would allow at the time. Now I could hear Diego's footsteps running to my right. A block later, without stopping, I asked what on earth someone would be doing inside the school at that hour. When I turned, I realized it wasn't Diego running beside me. Instead, a blond boy in strange clothes was running next to me, never taking his eyes off me and smiling. I tried to run faster and turn at the next street, even though it took me away from the path home. But the boy, unfazed, kept pace with me, laughing at me. I reached the main street again and finally lost him. Completely exhausted, I stopped to rest, hiding and running from lamp to take advantage of the darkness of the streets back then. I managed to approach my street again, almost unnoticed. A block from home, I saw my mother walking hurriedly with Mari Carmen. She was clearly worried because it was late and I hadn't arrived. When she saw me, her expression lit up with relief, but then quickly changed to angry glare. She began to scold me for the worry I had caused her. "Now go to the church and find your brother," she said. My blood ran cold. The last thing I wanted was to go back up there, but when I tried to explain what had happened to me, she scolded me again, not believing a word. Crying, I started my journey once more, climbing through the neighborhood to look for Carlos, who had gone up to find me. A few blocks ahead, a shout put me on high alert. Suddenly, from the darkness, 2 figures were sprinting toward me at full speed. I wanted to run back home, but out of fear, I think, my legs became completely clumsy and I just felt myself stumble. The figures were getting closer. I could even hear their breathing. One ran past me and the other grabbed my arms and lifted me up. It was my brother, Carlos, and without saying a word, I knew something was chasing them. I realized that the figure now running ahead of us was Diego, and he turned when he reached my street. He dashed into the house, even leaving us behind. He was very scared, I knew, and he knew he wouldn't be able to run at that pace for 2 more blocks to reach his house. When we entered, I was horrified. Diego's face was covered in blood, and my mom attended to him immediately while ordering us to call his father. Diego wouldn't stop crying, and the more they cleaned the blood from his face, the more terrified I became. It looked as if a firecracker had exploded on his face, with pieces of skin hanging. His father wasn't there, didn't answer, but a few minutes later one of his neighbors arrived, and they took him to the emergency hospital. My mother kept asking us what had happened, but I had no idea, and Carlos swore he didn't know what had happened either. I didn't know what had occurred. Due to the fright we all had, my mother didn't press any further. She prepared a very light dinner for us and sent us to bed. Carlos then approached to tell me he was going to share what he had seen, but I had to swear not to tell our mom. He then recounted what had happened. My mom was very worried about me, so she sent him to look for me. He ran up through the neighborhood. He was about halfway between the house and the church, almost reaching the school, when heard the sound of something passing above him like flying. He looked up, but there was nothing, so he continued. However, after advancing just a few steps, a child's voice called to him from behind. "Hey, over here." When he turned, he saw a child pointing him toward the street. And from the description, it was the same child who had run beside me when I was fleeing from the school. Carlos hesitated but decided to follow the boy, who seemed to know something he didn't. As he approached the street, he saw a group of children standing in a circle, looking at something on the ground. When he got closer, he realized they were all staring at a dark, moving shape. At first, Carlos thought it might be animal, but as he moved closer, he saw it was a person, or at least something that resembled one. The figure was hunched over, doing something that Carlos couldn't quite make out. Fear gripped him, and he instinctively picked up a rock and threw it at the shape. It let out a high-pitched scream and bounded away with incredible speed, leaping down the street. Carlos rushed to the figure lying on the ground and realized it was a child, covered in blood. It was Diego. Carlos helped him up and asked if he knew where I was. Diego, struggling to open his eyes because of the blood, pointed towards the main street, indicating I had run that way. Without another word, Diego took off in the opposite direction, as if possessed by a sense of urgency. Carlos turned around and saw 4 nuns approaching in a line. Their hands were clasped in front of them as if in prayer, but their pace was unnaturally fast. It was as if they were gliding towards him. Terrified, Carlos started running too, and after a few blocks he found me. I was backing away in fear until I slipped. Carlos helped me up, and together we made it home just behind Diego. My mother wouldn't believe what had happened, but Carlos was adamant. He said he had seen them before, those women dressed like nuns, sometimes near the church, watching, lingering. "Do you know why I never made my first communion?" he asked me. "Is it because you don't believe in God?" I replied, more as a question than a confident answer. "No, it was because of them," he said. "I'll tell you why." And so, he began his tale. He too had attended catechism classes. Back then they were held earlier, and afterward they would play soccer in the field next to the church, right in front of the convent. The nuns were always kind, sometimes even offering them water. But one day, a group of nuns dressed entirely in black appeared. They stood on the street above the field, murmuring curses as the children played. They weren't on the church side, but rather on the opposite side, watching. Their words were menacing, filled with malice. The children tried to ignore them until one of the youngest boys approached them to retrieve a ball. A girl from the group of nuns then ran towards him as if to catch him. He started running towards us, crying, while the others laughed hysterically, almost shrieking. As we watched them, the door of the convent opened behind us, and one of the young nuns shouted for us to get inside the church. We all ran, but I managed to turn around. 2 young nuns emerged from the convent, heading quickly, almost threateningly, towards the others who were standing by the church grounds. When they saw them, they began to run, but with a terrible laugh. I remember then that one of our catechists, who was just a teenager herself, approached us and told us not to stay playing so late anymore, especially when they were around. I asked her if those nuns in black were bad, and she said they certainly weren't nuns, but rather crazy people just trying to scare us. At that moment, my brother paused in his story, took a deep breath as if reaching a painful moment, and then continued. But I am sure they were worse than she thought, that they weren't just trying to scare us. Not long after we first saw them, what happened to Alan took place. Carlos stopped again in his story, and I knew why. I knew what he meant. Alan was a classmate of his who had passed away. They didn't tell me much about it because I was very young, but I knew it had been in a very terrible way. Among the first graders at school, completely wild stories were told about it. For those unfamiliar, the Huaycura neighborhood is on a sort of small hill, ending in a ravine one side. These ravines led to a stream with a dirt path beside it. Today there's a busy boulevard in Tijuana there, but in the early 90s, none of that existed. Alan's body was found in the stream. I remember well that several children gathered at the ravines, where the streets of the neighborhood ended, to watch all the police activity and the curious onlookers who came to the scene. Alan had been playing soccer with us that day when we saw them, my brother continued, and later saw them again one night very close to the school. When he said that, I remembered the vision Diego and I had a while back at school. I thought about what might have happened if my brother hadn't arrived when they knocked him down in the street. And even if they mocked me, that was the easiest part to believe. From there, the most macabre and bizarre events of my experience occurred. The next time I saw Diego, it was from a distance. He was peering out from one of the windows of his house, and half of his face was covered with bandages hiding his wounds. That day his father was preparing to move. We didn't notice when they left, and they didn't say goodbye to the neighbors. We understood that moving was common back then, and there wasn't much fuss when a family left the neighborhood. But despite the urgency, only Carlos, my mother, and I suspected that it had something to do with what happened that night. Since then, Carlos would accompany me every day he could, especially when I had to return late from catechism or my friends' houses. Even today, with everything that happened later, my mother feels guilty for not giving the situation the importance it deserved. There were 2 or 3 days of calm until one afternoon when we noticed Oliver's absence. Oliver was a stray cat we had adopted a few months earlier when he was just a kitten. He usually disappeared in the mornings, but every afternoon as we all arrived home, he would show up without fail, often bringing a bird, a mouse, or some dead insect as a gift. However, that day it was past 8 and Oliver hadn't appeared. My mother and Carlos went out to buy bread for dinner and to look for Oliver in the neighboring streets. I stayed home alone, just with Mari Carmen, who was sleeping in the next room. From a distance on the street, I heard a cat screech. It was horrible, terrifying. It started like the sounds cats make when they're in heat, but soon turned into something frightening. Without a doubt, they were cries of pain. I ran out, thinking Oliver might have encountered a dog, but as soon as I reached the street, the screeches stopped abruptly. For a moment, it was as if a voice told me to run into the darkness of the street. I took a few steps but then felt as if I came to my senses. Behind me the gate door was open, as was the door to my house, wide open. I ran back, feeling that I needed to take care of Mari Carmen, who was the most important thing at that moment. As soon as I closed the door, the screeches began again. I'm sure I wasn't the only one who heard them. I couldn't have been the only one. The sound grew closer, and shortly after, when I heard it almost in front of my house, it stopped again, completely. Then I heard something on the roof. The thud. As if something heavy had been dropped and bounced towards the sky. It was obvious that something had been thrown at the house. Something dead had been thrown at the house. The sound of the gate alerted me, followed by the sound of the living room door. The voices of my mother and brother reassured me. They were joking, happy. So, I understood they hadn't heard the cat, nor had they seen anything. What happened next was my mistake, I know. But I didn't say anything at that moment. It was so rare to have moments like that, of peace, jokes, or laughter, that I chose to wait. I chose to stay quiet and wait. And maybe this is a feeling only those who have lived in families with as many problems as mine will recognize. While we're having dinner, I heard a movement on the roof. Imperceptible to the others, but not to me, as I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened just a short while ago. Dinner continued. And suddenly, something seemed to shake violently up there. This time everyone noticed. Carlos quickly put on his jacket to go up and check. I rushed out behind him, trying to get there first. He loved Oliver more than anyone. I felt I had to spare him a greater shock if it really was our cat up on the roof. I told him I would go up and he should hold the wooden ladder we used. It's about to break, and if you fall I can't catch you. But you can catch me, I said. And he listened. When I climbed up, in the distance I could see a figure. It was Oliver. Or so I thought. However, he was standing looking out at the street with his back to me. I called out to him, but he ignored me. I whistled. I called him in every way that usually made him obey, but he remained unmoved. What's wrong? My brother asked. Is he okay? Yes, I said. Don't worry. But just as I said that, Oliver, or the cat that was on our roof, slowly turned towards me. As if it knew what I was doing to avoid alarming my brother. As if that creature could mock me. What I saw then is one of the things that haunts me every night when I try to sleep. Even today, every time I close my eyes. When I turned, a half smile on the cat froze my heart. And part of the animal's face seemed to be that of a child. A face very similar to Diego's. Instinctively, I took a step back, causing me to fall from the ladder. I fell on Carlos, who hadn't calculated my weight, and we took quite a tumble. After that, I only remember that we both cried and that my mom somehow managed to carry us both inside the house. The next thing I remember is waking up in the morning with a severe headache. Which was no excuse for my mother not to wake us up at 6:30 in the morning to get ready for school. Throughout the morning, I tried to convince myself that the sight of that cat or whatever it was had only been a product of my imagination, the darkness, and my anxiety. Cesar approached me during recess, a 6th grader who lived at the end of our street. When he came up to me, I instinctively thought he would try to bother or hit me. It was a typical reaction when an older kid approached me or anyone in my group of friends. This time, however, Cesar seemed serious and clearly intent on asking me something. He asked what happens at night in front of my house. I told him I didn't know what he was talking about. Cesar replied that his dad always comes home late from work and had mentioned that last night there were 3 nuns standing on the sidewalk in front of my house, peering inside. His mom said his dad came home looking pale. Hearing this, I couldn't respond and ran off. I found Carlos near his classroom, but before I could tell him what I had just learned, I felt again that I couldn't do it, that we would end up worrying my mom, and the last thing we needed was another concern at that moment. It was a strange feeling. I believed that by keeping it to myself, it was less real, that if I didn't talk about the things happening, they would simply stop. I wanted to forget about it and asked my mom for permission to stay at Raul's house, one of my classmates who had a collection of Saint Seiya toys that made it a bit easier to tolerate his bragging. Time slipped away at his house for Oscar, my best friend, and me. We played in Raul's room until his mom came up to invite us to dinner, in a tone that clearly suggested it was time for us to go home. We said our goodbyes and Oscar dashed off, insisting he would be in trouble for being late. Suddenly, reality hit me. I was only a few blocks from home, but the street seemed more ominous than usual. Once more, it felt as if everyone had agreed to go inside and close their doors and curtains by 8 at night. I started walking slowly as if it would make me braver, but a silhouette darted across the street, making me quicken my pace. It was a cat crossing the street, perhaps just a cat, but the vision of the previous night became more vivid. The only thing I was grateful for was that the full moon illuminated the way home a bit. Suddenly, I felt a tightness in my chest and couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I started looking around while hurrying my steps until, on a wall in the darkness, I saw the figure of that cat again, with almost human features and a body eerily similar to our Oliver. I looked away as if I wouldn't have noticed, and I kept walking. The cat seemed to run alongside me. The wall it was on ended, and it began jumping from roof to roof, never straying from me, even though by then I was running as fast as my body, sore from the previous day's fall, would allow. Suddenly, I stopped hearing those little jumps of the cat following me from roof to roof. Exhaustion forced me to stop almost as I reached my street and look around. I felt a bit more at ease seeing it wasn't there anymore. I turned around to head home, and at the corner, right on the sidewalk where I had to pass to turn towards my house, half of a black silhouette seemed to be peeking out at me, waiting for me to pass by. As soon as I saw it, it hid again and I lost sight of it. I didn't need much imagination to realize that silhouette was of someone, a person dressed or disguised as a nun. At that moment, I was only about 150 meters from my house. However, I felt as if I would never see my mom or my siblings again. I started crying, knowing I couldn't go back to Raul's house, but I also couldn't get closer to my house without having to pass by where that figure was waiting for me. I wished with all my heart that none of this was really happening and that I would open my eyes in a moment and wake up at home next to my mom. And see her preparing dinner. And when I had that image in my head, a giggle behind me made me stop crying. It was the gypsy boy laughing at me, but somehow it didn't feel like mockery. Before I could say anything, he took my hand and started running towards my street. And I don't know how, but I ran with him, terrified. As we turned onto my street, 3 figures dressed as nuns were waiting for us, crouched on the sidewalk, and when they saw us, they started running as if to catch us. The boy threw a stone that hit one of the nuns in the face, who didn't even flinch, but it caught their attention enough for them to pass me by and follow him instead. "Run, run!" he shouted without stopping laughing, and the boy ran down the street with the 3 figures following him very, very closely. I entered my house and endured a terrible scolding from my mother for being late again. While she scolded me and told me how upset she was with me, all I could do was hug her, grateful for the chance to be with her again. But at the same time, I couldn't stop thinking about the boy's fate. The child was left speechless. When I say that in those 2 years the child stopped speaking, I can't say I didn't experience it. In those days, the colony seemed to be inhabited only by the strangest characters. I'm completely serious. There were 2 of them who might be easily remembered by those who lived there at that time. They were 2 little men who looked like twins, both with thin mustaches reminiscent of the 50s, their skin perpetually damp with sweat, and always dressed in suits and hats. There was one more detail that made them a bit macabre, perhaps, to put it in some way. At least for the children in the colony who watched them closely. Both had an extra little foot protruding from their leg at ankle height. They were rarely seen, but they were striking. They always left very early to take public transport and returned late at night. Some of my friends said they lived in one of the old, crumbling tenements, but in reality no one knew for sure where they lived. As a child they always scared me a little. But I never thought they would end up being the protagonists of the most terrifying night of my life. I was only 8 years old. I didn't have a girl. I didn't have a son. And the trap in the arch difficult. Before turning to his house, there was that old tenement, abandoned for years, now inhabited by 3 families of gypsies. They were called Bulgarians, but even though they spoke little Spanish, I'm not sure they were originally from Bulgaria. When I passed by, the figure peering through the window caught my attention. I could see it clearly silhouetted by the candlelight inside. More than fear, I felt curiosity. I was eager for it to be that child who, I thought, had saved my life and soul the night before. I stood waiting, watching, hoping to find a familiar figure. And eventually I did, though it wasn't the one I wished for. When they saw me, I suppose, standing in front of them, they suddenly turned off the light, leaving the window in complete darkness. That's when I noticed it. Up on the roof was the figure of the cat again, the cat with a child's face that had followed me home the previous night. One thing I had learned during those days was that the presence of that being heralded the proximity of the nuns. So, I hurried to walk to Oscar's house. I tried to remain calm, but when I heard the dogs barking in the distance, I ran again until I reached my friend's house. Behind me, I could hear the barking getting closer. First, it was blocks away, and then very near, perhaps on the next street. Upon arriving at Oscar's house, I did something I had never done before. I opened the gate and went straight to the door to knock. I don't know if it was because of that detail or the late hour, but Oscar's mom opened the door looking quite angry. As I stood there, I was thinking about what excuse I could use to stay for a while until those things moved away, but with such a reception, I knew my chances were slim. I asked Oscar's mom if I could use the phone to call my mom and let her know I had arrived. She hesitated for a moment but then agreed, asking me not to speak loudly since almost everyone in the house was asleep. I approached slowly, observing everything, biding my time, listening to the dogs in the houses on the street starting to bark, until even the dog from the house across the street was barking. Oscar's mom seemed to ignore it and went to the kitchen. I picked up the phone nervously and started dialing my home number reflexively, but I knew it wouldn't be a real call. If I dared to tell my mom that something was following me, that I was in danger, she would come for me immediately, even if Carlos wasn't there to accompany her, and she would do it with Mari Carmen by her side or perhaps leaving her alone at home. And to be honest, both options terrified me equally. I hung up the phone, knowing my time to pretend that call or actually dial had run out, and that I would have to return to the street. But a voice behind me in the completely dark living room called out to me. They're outside. Who is it? I asked, trying to recognize the figure now with its back to me. The lady went to the living room and I realized it was Oscar's brother, a boy whose name I sadly can't remember, but who, despite having left elementary school several years before me, was practically a legend for his talent in playing soccer, for having been in the state team, and for having completely given up that sport in high school. He was in the youth ranks of an important team in the country. He had, as they said, given it up to focus on school. "Come on, I'll take you," he said to me. Before I could respond, he was already heading to the yard, and I followed him without even saying goodbye to Oscar's mom. I knew I had to seize this opportunity to have someone accompany me. From a corner of the yard, the boy returned with a bike that had pegs on the back wheels, big enough for me to stand on. He told me to hop on and positioned himself at the garden gate leading to the street, leaving it slightly ajar. I already told Erica that these women are roaming around the neighborhood and always hang out near the church at night. I don't like her staying out so late. Then I realized a rumor was true, that this boy was Erica's boyfriend, my catechism teacher. It made sense why we often saw him circling around the church on his bike. I was thinking about this when a sudden jerk almost threw me off the bike. Within seconds we're speeding out of the house, pedaling at full speed, and as we turned the corner he skidded to a stop so low that we nearly fell. But we continued at high speed, taking advantage of the downhill street we had joined. The barking I heard seemed to signal a warning. The presence of those things was left behind, but he didn't seem to want to slow down. Suddenly, the sight of headlights coming towards us made him veer off without even braking a little, jumping onto the sidewalk. I had seen him do extreme things on his bike before, but I was surprised he could do it with me on board. However, the fear of falling was much more bearable than the thought of encountering those people again. I couldn't face those nuns again. Suddenly, two figures darted across the narrow sidewalk we're on, and despite his efforts to brake, we collided with one. I managed to let go moments before the crash and only scraped my knees and hands. Oscar's brother also avoided injury, even though his bike flew several meters. The figure we hit let out a cry of pain, and suddenly the other one came over to help it up. "Here they come," it said, pulling the other up, and without even acknowledging us they ran away. I hurried to help Oscar's brother up. We grabbed the bike and continued at full speed towards my house. Just a few meters ahead we passed those figures. I realized they were the two dwarf twins. Oscar's brother shouted some insult at them which they didn't respond to. As we moved away I stared at them intently. Their faces bore an expression of deep fear, and they ran as fast as their deformed legs would allow. I thanked Oscar's brother when he dropped me off and we bumped fists. I wanted to hug him, but instead I just bumped his fist and shouted my thanks as I ran into my house. Dozens of dogs were barking desperately in the distance, more violently each time, and I didn't know what to think, but at last I felt safe. When I got inside my mom scolded me. She scolded me, saying it was the last time I would leave my things at someone else's house, and I could barely catch my breath. However, I nodded repeatedly, knowing she was right. It was the second time someone had selflessly helped me escape the fate of facing those things. The next morning, my mom was having breakfast with one of her best friends. An elderly lady who had always been like an adoptive grandmother to us. My mother told her about my fall from the roof, and then they both asked me about the recent scrapes, so I had to explain that I had fallen off a bike the night before. "Someone is looking out for you," the lady said with a deep gaze. "Maybe it's your dad from heaven, wanting you to make it safely to your first communion." I didn't know what to say, but it made me think, even as a child, that the luck I'd had those days might not be normal. On the way to school we came across a vacant lot almost in front of a small triangular park, this time filled with police and onlookers. My mom didn't like getting close to such things and made me walk without even turning around. At school, Oscar ran up to me as soon as he saw me. He said his brother had been severely scolded for sneaking out with me at night and that it took him a long time to get back home. He said his brother claimed to have seen the gypsy boy peeking out of the window of the tenement when he was heading back to their house. And as he told me this, Oscar grew very serious, as if he had said something crazy. "What's so strange about that?" I asked. "The gypsies live there." "No, not anymore. They all left days ago and abandoned the tenement," Oscar said. Perhaps because of this news I spent the rest of the day at school like a zombie, thinking more about the gypsy boy and what had happened to me the night before. After classes I went to the tenement and realized everything seemed true. There were even things scattered outside the little houses as if left in the middle of the gypsies' flight. It seemed strange that I hadn't noticed those details the previous night, but when I looked through the window, the same window where I had seen the figure, I almost felt as if someone was looking back at me. The streets were filled with police and were told there was nothing we could do. We realized why hours later when we saw the evening news. The body of one of the little men had been found, so disfigured from the beating he received that it was unrecognizable. This detail wasn't mentioned in the news, but among the first neighbors who discovered the body, a macabre detail began to circulate. They had torn off his little foot that grew from his ankle. The other little man was never seen again. At that time, the city wasn't accustomed to such violence as perhaps it is today. The news was alarming for the neighborhood residents. Even the catechism classes we attended were rescheduled to start earlier. However, I didn't feel well. I spent a few days in apparent tranquility until one afternoon when my mom came in with freshly dried clothes and told my brother that his cat was on the neighbor's roof. Carlos ran out and I followed him, but by the time we got outside, we only saw a silhouette speeding away. That night, the dogs didn't stop barking on our street. I looked out the window from our room and sometimes thought it was a dog. But it wasn't a dog. I thought I saw silhouettes of people walking on the roofs near ours. I couldn't sleep all night. Although I couldn't see the nuns, I knew they were there. I could feel them, and that made it even more terrifying. But it wasn't only me who was frightened. I don't know how many people, especially children, suffered the same thing during those times. It was well known back then what happened to a girl from the same primary school I attended, but in the afternoon shift. It happened as she was leaving, almost at dusk. At the end of the school, on a side that bordered a ravine, there was a completely white dirt area where some children would go to play. This girl had forgotten something there, and when she left school, instead of heading straight for the exit, she ran to that far end of the school. This area also bordered a kindergarten, completely deserted at that hour. It said that the girl saw someone walking among the kindergarten classrooms. She approached the fence dividing the two schools to get a better look. And then she recognized the figure. It was a nun. The girl didn't get scared at first, as she thought it was a real nun who, for some reason, was doing some work in the kindergarten at that hour. So she even listened when the woman called her. The girl's screams then drew the attention of students and teachers, who saw her in distress in the kindergarten. It was an open secret that reached us from the afternoon kids. Something happened. That's all I managed to find out. Something occurred in the church that they didn't tell us about, but our ceremony was postponed by 2 weeks. Oscar's brother heard from Erica, the catechist, that someone had broken in to vandalize the place. I could never verify it, but indeed, the next time we entered the church, several repairs were noticeable. Another child disappeared in the neighborhood during those days. The rumor of a group of child snatchers, as they were called, who sought out unattended children to abduct them and sell their organs, had spread, but a few of us still thought that perhaps those nuns had something to do with it. When I dared to talk about them with my mother, I realized that she and her friends had encountered them at some point many years ago. They had been roaming the streets at night for a long time, and people just considered them crazy. Some even said they were nuns expelled from their convent for dark practices. The truth is that no one knew where they came from or where they took refuge. My mother's friend, the lady I mentioned who was like a grandmother to me, died the day before the new date of my first communion. My mother spent the whole day at her house, receiving the lady's relatives who had traveled from afar to say their goodbyes. She took Mari Carmen with her, and I stayed with Carlos. Something beyond the grief of the lady's death weighed on me. It made me feel sad and empty inside. Carlos felt the same. Suddenly, Freddie, one of Carlos's friends, arrived at the house shouting for us to come with him. They found the nun's house, he yelled. It's a cave made in the yard of an abandoned house near the church. For a moment, we didn't believe him, but he continued with the story, very sure of what he was saying. They had seen them enter with a small child crying, and the neighbors had come out. They locked themselves in the cave, and that's where I came from. Without thinking, Carlos put on his jacket and grabbed his bike. He ordered me to stay, but I didn't dare. 5 minutes after they had left, I ran out on my scooter, heading to the church to see if anyone was around. But I was told there was no one. I thought I could find the commotion from the discovery and follow the noise. About 15 minutes later, I arrived completely exhausted at the church. But there was no one around. I heard nothing. I moved down the street to an area of the neighborhood I had never been to, and the night was completely silent. Peaceful and quiet. I reached a place, a house that looked a lot like the description Freddie had just given us. But there was no one there. The neighboring houses seemed deserted. The lights remained off even though it was just about 10 at night. I backed away fearfully until the screeching sound caught my attention. The horrendous noise of a cat came from the yard of the house I had reached. I hurried to get to the church, and I swear I saw the figure of a nun watching me from the roof of the church, hidden behind the tower. My hands began to tremble, and I could barely manage my scooter due to the fear I felt at that moment. I passed by the school and could see clearly, just like before, the same nun I had seen weeks earlier watching me from the same classroom, from the same window. This time, Carlos didn't even know I had run after him. My mother was busy at her friend's house. This time there was no gypsy boy or Oscar's brother to help me get home safely. And in the middle of the night, I saw a third nun's figure waiting for me about 50 meters down the street. I turned around and ran towards the school and then to the main street. At some point I lost my scooter and just ran as fast as my legs would allow. In the darkness that seemed to have taken over the entire neighborhood, I found a door open one side. It was wide open, and without thinking, I entered that house to ask for help. I went in shouting that I was alone and needed help, that someone wanted to take me. A man appeared in the living room, surprised, and asked me to tell him what had happened. A bald, shirtless man, filthy and speaking in a barely audible, strange manner, stood before me. I pleaded with him to accompany me home, to help me find my mother and brother. But without a word, he put on thick glasses, glanced at the street and locked the door behind me. No. It's not safe to go out now, he said. When I told him I wanted to leave, he sternly insisted it was too dangerous for me to go outside. He went to another room and instructed me to find something to eat in the kitchen. I was overwhelmed with dizziness, unable to believe I had fallen into the clutches of a madman after everything else I had experienced. I didn't know who he was or what might happen next, but I knew I couldn't stay there. I had to take my chances with whatever was outside. The door was locked, but I managed to open a window while he shouted and tried to stop me. I scrambled out into the street and heard laughter behind me. When I turned, the man was laughing from his doorway, telling me he couldn't believe it. And above him, the figure of a cat seemed to observe me, amused. I can't explain it, but the cat's movements, or perhaps it was just my imagination, made it seem like both the man and the cat were laughing in unison. I ran home to find Carlos hanging up the phone. He looked pale, as if he'd seen a ghost. I asked what had happened, but he ignored me, packed a few things into his school backpack and told me to be quiet. He didn't ask where I'd been and wouldn't let me explain what had just happened. I have to go, he said, touching my head before opening the door and leaving. I watched from the window as a car passed by. It looked a bit like his father's car, but I wasn't sure. Nor was I sure if Carlos got in. That was the last time I saw my brother. I didn't make my first communion the next day, nor ever after. My mother spent the following weeks searching for Carlos everywhere, but there was no trace of him or his father. Carlos's father had always gotten along well with my mother after their separation, so it was strange to think he would take my brother away. My mother was devastated and the police had no leads. As time went on, the case grew cold. I tried to tell her about the nuns, about the things I had seen, but she wouldn't listen. She was too consumed by her grief and the desperate hope that Carlos would return. Life went on, but nothing was the same. I felt like a shadow of myself, haunted by those events and the loss of my brother. I had nightmares for years, dreams where I was being chased by the nuns, where the cat with the child's face would appear, taunting me. I kept these fears to myself, afraid that speaking about them would somehow make them real again. Over time, the neighborhood changed. New families moved in and the old stories faded away. But I never forgot. I couldn't. Even now, as an adult, I avoid that part of town. I can't bring myself to go near the church or the school. The memories are too strong, too vivid. Sometimes when I drive past, I feel the hairs on my neck stand up as if something is watching me, waiting for me to return. But I never do. I can't. I won't. Except for a few specific moments. We moved from there before I started kindergarten, so I don't remember walking the streets of that place. However, recently, a cousin shared with me a video they made about the history of the First Communion. He's a bit older and even remembered visiting us in that house in that neighborhood. I was curious when I heard it and asked my parents if they had any information about it or if it was true about the appearance of those nuns in the neighborhood, but none of them knew anything. No one had ever seen or heard anything about it. My cousin and I listened to the final chapter together at a family gathering. We went out and talked a bit about it, and one of my uncles overheard us. He asked what we're talking about, and when we told him, he ended up sharing his experience. He had seen something similar, but not precisely in that neighborhood, rather a few kilometers away, climbing Cerro Colorado. I think he said the neighborhood was called Azteca. My uncle rented a little house near the last streets before the closure made it impossible to continue building. He had just arrived in Tijuana. It was in the 1980s then. He befriended some young men who lived in a tiny room next to him. They were from Oaxaca and always invited him to eat. Obviously, my uncle loved eating with them and, not knowing many people in the city, started spending every weekend with them. Sometimes they would climb to the top of Cerro Colorado to see the whole city from there. Back then, they were practically on the outskirts of Tijuana. Today, this hill is almost the center of the entire city. One of those times, they climbed up a bit late. They stayed up there for a while until night fell. They were going to try to descend by a more dangerous path that would take them much closer to the house. The night was about to fall completely. Before descending carefully through an area where they could no longer walk and would have to crawl, one of his neighbors asked him to turn around. In the distance they saw a group of 7 silhouettes climbing the hill. They were in a line and leaning forward. Due to the darkness they only recognized a silhouette and had no idea what or who it was. "They're girls," said one of them confidently, although he hadn't seen them either. "Let's see what they're doing. Let's see what they're doing. Let's see what they're doing. Let's see what they're doing." Being young, for some reason they thought it was a good idea. 3 of them ran back, climbing again, excited about what they thought was a group of girls. But it didn't make much sense for girls to climb to that place at that hour. Though it wasn't as dangerous as it is nowadays, after a few minutes they thought they had lost sight of them. But then, after a while, they could see them again, thanks to the light of a bonfire in a clearing before reaching the top. They wondered how the girls had climbed so fast. They had gotten way ahead. It was impossible. But one of them suggested that maybe the girls knew a better route. As they approached, they planned to say they were lost and ask if they could stay with them. But as they got closer, they grew worried. They began to hear chanting. One of the girls was saying some words. That language. Something inside them told them they should be afraid. The 7 women seemed to be standing, contemplating a figure, something burning in the center of the fire. They appeared to be dressed as nuns. My uncle and the others stopped about 100 meters away, watching from hiding. But one of the women suddenly spotted them and, with a shriek, started running towards them. The boys began to run too. They descended, fell, rolled, got up. The woman's shriek grew closer and closer. They ended up descending through a neighborhood that wasn't the one they had climbed and where they had never been. They ran towards a light on the first street visible as they came down the hill. Light was coming from a house, and there were people and children outside. It was one of those small houses that sometimes sold dinner. They ran inside, asking for help, scaring everyone present. Before they could finish explaining what had happened, the shriek was at the door. The nun, the woman, screamed menacingly from the sidewalk without entering. The children there ran down the street, and others went to the back of the house, crying in fear. The lady, who seemed to be selling the food, started yelling at that demonic thing to leave. She approached it, threatening it with a large knife. "Leave in the name of God," she shouted, while the woman just smiled, mocking. When the lady got close enough, threatening to cut her, the nun ran back up the hill in leaps. 2 neighbors, who had just arrived, asked for help to chase her, but they were finally convinced by the lady that it was not a good idea, and they returned to their homes. "It's been a long time since they passed through here," said the lady, and then she offered food to my uncle and the 2 boys with him. My uncle endured living there for a whole year, right next to the hill. Carlos and I moved to a different neighborhood before I started kindergarten, so I don't remember much about walking those streets. However, recently, a cousin shared a story with me about our first communion. He's a bit older and even recalled visiting us in that house in that neighborhood. I was curious when I heard it and asked my parents if they knew anything about the appearances of those nuns, but they didn't. No one had ever seen or heard anything about it. My cousin and I listened to the story together at a family gathering. We went outside to talk about it and one of my uncles overheard us. He asked what we're discussing, and when we told him, he shared his own experience. He had seen something similar but not precisely in that neighborhood. It was a few kilometers away, climbing Cerro Colorado. I think he mentioned the neighborhood was called Azteca. My uncle rented a little house near the last streets before construction was no longer possible. He had just arrived in Tijuana. It was in the 1980s. He befriended some young men who lived in a tiny room next to him. They were from Oaxaca and always invited him to eat. Naturally, my uncle loved eating with them and, not knowing many people in the city, started spending every weekend with them. Sometimes they would climb to the top of Cerro Colorado to see the whole city from there. Back then, they were practically on the outskirts of Tijuana. Today, this hill is almost the center of the entire city. One time they climbed up a bit late. They stayed up there for a while until night fell. They were going to try to descend by a more dangerous path that would take them much closer to the house. The night was about to fall completely. Before descending carefully through an area where they could no longer walk and would have to crawl, one of his neighbors asked him to turn around. In the distance they saw a group of 7 silhouettes climbing the hill. They were in a line and leaning forward. Due to the darkness, they only recognized a silhouette and had no idea what or who it was. "They're girls," said one of them confidently, although he hadn't seen them either. "Let's see what they're doing." Being young, for some reason they thought it was a good idea. 3 of them ran back, climbing again, excited about what they thought was a group of girls. But it didn't make much sense for girls to climb to that place at that hour. Though it wasn't as dangerous as it is nowadays, after a few minutes they thought they had lost sight of them. But then, after a while, they could see them again, thanks to the light of a bonfire in a clearing before reaching the top. They wondered how the girls had climbed so fast. They had gotten way ahead. It was impossible. But one of them suggested that maybe the girls knew a better route. As they approached, they planned to say they were lost and ask if they could stay with them. But as they got closer, they grew worried. They began to hear chanting. One of the girls was saying some words. That language. Something inside them told them they should be afraid. The 7 women seemed to be standing, contemplating a figure, something burning in the center of the fire. They appeared to be dressed as nuns. My uncle and the others stopped about 100 meters away, watching from hiding. But one of the women suddenly spotted them and, with a shriek, started running towards them. The boys began to run too. They descended, fell, rolled, got up. The woman's shriek grew closer and closer. They ended up descending through a neighborhood that wasn't the one they had climbed and where they had never been. They ran towards a light on the first street visible as they came down the hill. Light was coming from a house, and there were people and children outside. It was one of those small houses that sometimes sold dinner. They ran inside, asking for help, scaring everyone present. Before they could finish explaining what had happened, the shriek was at the door. The nun, the woman, screamed menacingly from the sidewalk without entering. The children there ran down the street, and others went to the back of the house, crying in fear. The lady, who seemed to be selling the food, started yelling at that demonic thing to leave. She approached it, threatening it with a large knife. "Leave in the name of God," she shouted, while the woman just smiled, mocking. When the lady got close enough, threatening to cut her, the nun ran back up the hill in leaps. 2 neighbors, who had just arrived, asked for help to chase her, but they were finally convinced by the lady that it was not a good idea, and they returned to their homes. "It's been a long time since they passed through here," said the lady, and then she offered food to my uncle and the 2 boys with him. My uncle endured living there for a whole year, right next to the hill. My uncle rented a little house near the last streets before construction was no longer possible. He had just arrived in Tijuana. It was in the 1980s. He befriended some young men who lived in a tiny room next to him. They were from Oaxaca and always invited him to eat. Naturally, my uncle loved eating with them and, not knowing many people in the city, started spending every weekend with them. Sometimes they would climb to the top of Cerro Colorado to see the whole city from there. Back then, they were practically on the outskirts of Tijuana. Today, this hill is almost the center of the entire city. One time they climbed up a bit late. They stayed up there for a while until night fell. They were going to try to descend by a more dangerous path that would take them much closer to the house. The night was about to fall completely. Before descending carefully through an area where they could no longer walk and would have to crawl, one of his neighbors asked him to turn around. In the distance they saw a group of 7 silhouettes climbing the hill. They were in a line and leaning forward. Due to the darkness they only recognized a silhouette and had no idea what or who it was. "They're girls," said one of them confidently, although he hadn't seen them either. "Let's see what they're doing." Being young, for some reason they thought it was a good idea. 3 of them ran back, climbing again, excited about what they thought was a group of girls. But it didn't make much sense for girls to climb to that place at that hour. Though it wasn't as dangerous as it is nowadays, after a few minutes they thought they had lost sight of them. But then, after a while, they could see them again, thanks to the light of a bonfire in a clearing before reaching the top. They wondered how the girls had climbed so fast. They had gotten way ahead. It was impossible. But one of them suggested that maybe the girls knew a better route. As they approached, they planned to say they were lost and ask if they could stay with them. But as they got closer, they grew worried. They began to hear chanting. One of the girls was saying some words. That language. Something inside them told them they should be afraid. The 7 women seemed to be standing, contemplating a figure, something burning in the center of the fire. They appeared to be dressed as nuns. My uncle and the others stopped about 100 meters away, watching from hiding. But one of the women suddenly spotted them and, with a shriek, started running towards them. The boys began to run too. They descended, fell, rolled, got up. The woman's shriek grew closer and closer. They ended up descending through a neighborhood that wasn't the one they had climbed and where they had never been. They ran towards a light on the first street visible as they came down the hill. Light was coming from a house and there were people and children outside. It was one of those small houses that sometimes sold dinner. They ran inside, asking for help, scaring everyone present. Before they could finish explaining what had happened, the shriek was at the door. The nun, the woman, screamed menacingly from the sidewalk without entering. The children there ran down the street and others went to the back of the house, crying in fear. The lady, who seemed to be selling the food, started yelling at that demonic thing to leave. She approached it, threatening it with a large knife. "Leave in the name of God," she shouted, while the woman just smiled, mocking. When the lady got close enough, threatening to cut her, the nun ran back up the hill in leaps. 2 neighbors, who had just arrived, asked for help to chase her, but they were finally convinced by the lady that it was not a good idea, and they returned to their homes. "It's been a long time since they passed through here," said the lady, and then she offered food to my uncle and the 2 boys with him. My uncle endured living there for a whole year, right next to the hill. The road back to Nayarit, where all the siblings were from, was a journey my uncle often took. Curiously, he hitchhiked or jumped onto trains when he could. He had traveled the route between Tijuana and Tepic several times, but on this occasion he never reached his destination and never returned. He simply disappeared. There was an ongoing debate between my father and Uncle Pedro. My father believed Uncle Beto had likely met with an accident and never reached his intended stop. However, Uncle Pedro insisted that Uncle Beto hadn't informed anyone of his departure, which was unusual because he never left without telling everyone. That night, he left my father's house and we never heard from him again. The truly terrifying part of this story is that my little cousin claimed a horrible cat visited him at night. Even when I babysat him, he would say the cat had chased him around the garden when he was alone. When we asked him to describe the cat, he would point to pictures of Uncle Beto. As he grew older, he stopped seeing it, or at least stopped mentioning it. But for me, dreams of a cat with Uncle Beto's eyes or those in his photographs haunted me. It's just a child's imagination, the dreams of a little girl. This story might not scare you much, but I cannot describe the chill I felt when the cat was mentioned, the one the child in the story had invented. I spent a good part of my life in the Huaycura neighborhood and still live just 5 minutes away in the El Lago neighborhood, literally across the ravine where they found the dead child. I remember my years there in complete tranquility, honestly. When I listened to the stories, I recalled some details that had always seemed bizarre, perhaps sinister, but never supernatural. My parents married in the church of that neighborhood, right in the mid-80s. I was always struck by the wedding photos. The event seemed very lonely because neither family attended, only a few friends. I vividly remember some of those photographs, leaving the church, next to a small field where they held fairs and where I believe children also played soccer, as mentioned in the story. In the background of several photos, The figures of nuns appeared to be watching the event, dressed entirely in black. To me they stood apart 1 meter from another, 6 in total, in complete symmetry. This detail was always strange to see and went beyond anything else. Photos. The ones from when I was a child. The next time I visit my parents' house, I will look for those photographs to share with you. I'll also ask them, as they lived much longer in that place and might know more about those strange figures we got used to seeing in the wedding photos. My grandparents lived in that city, in the neighborhood mentioned in the First Communion story. My grandmother still lives there, now only with her cats and a dozen lovebirds. When I was a child, there was a time we all gathered at my grandparents' house, all the cousins, to go trick-or-treating in that neighborhood on a Halloween night. We were left in the care of Emilio, the oldest cousin, who was no more than 15, and my sister Cece, who was around 14. They both had friends on the grandparents' street, so they left the rest of us to wander the neighborhood while they chatted with their friends on the block. So, we're a group of 5 kids, none older than 8, walking alone through the neighborhood at an hour when there weren't many other kids around, not even older ones. The houses handing out candy were starting to close their doors. For us, kids who were used to our parents' overprotection, it felt like an adventure to walk through unfamiliar streets, run from dogs, and look for candy in the few houses still giving it out at that hour of the night. At one point in the distance we saw a small child walking alone. But I mean a very, very small child, about 2 or 3 years old, in a little red devil costume. We walked toward where the child had gone, but there was no one around, just a long, solitary street. When we no longer saw him, we thought he had gone into one of the houses nearby. But just as we continued walking, his figure ran across the street from one side to the other, surprising us. Yet there was no crying or anything like that. Still, we're worried about him. We followed the child at a safe distance so as not to scare him but to see if he went into a house or if someone was looking for him. Finally, he slipped through the bars of a fence that protected a vacant lot. We reached it and peeked inside, but there was nothing to see beyond some bushes. While we debated what to do, Danny, one of my cousins, said he wouldn't be found, but without telling us, he ventured into the dark terrain, searching for the child. Then we heard him screaming for us to run, and from the darkness, we saw him emerging with a horrible figure chasing him. A very tall old woman was right behind him. Without thinking, we all started running, but a few meters ahead, we realized Danny wasn't with us. I turned back for him. Just as I reached the vacant lot, I saw him struggling to crawl under the fence, telling me to run. We quickly escaped from there. Later we checked him over. He only had scratches on his shoulders and face, and his candy was gone. When we nervously recounted the incident to our older cousins, they told us to share some of our candy with Danny and not to tell our grandparents. They assured us it was probably just a crazy person. But for us, and based on what Danny described, it always seemed like a witch. What we saw that night wasn't just a crazy person, it was a witch. I've sent videos of this First Communion story to everyone who witnessed it. I want to be sure, it's not that it wasn't a witch, but that it really was a witch. When I think of that woman, I imagine her dressed like the gypsies who used to live around there. I don't know if it's my memory or if I'm just mixing it with what I heard in this story. But every Halloween without fail we retell this story. It was a Halloween night. Yesterday. I also lived in that neighborhood from the story. Unlike the children in the tale, I was rarely allowed to go out at night. I lived on the last street of the neighborhood, named Punta Esteros. Across from my house was just a ravine leading to the Insurgentes Boulevard, and from our window, we could see the lights of much of the city. At the end of the street, a small wall enclosed it, with a huge house right at the edge. I saw a path through the hill that some people used to enter or leave the neighborhood. In the middle of that path was a strange construction that many barely noticed, there in the middle of the hill. It looked like the roof of a house, but it was only about a meter high. It always intrigued me to know that the neighborhood had a house of a kind that couldn't be seen. I didn't know what was inside, but I didn't like walking there much, so I spent a long time not knowing what the heck was there. Once, while with a school friend at my house, we decided to walk to the end of the street and down the hill along that path. It was a complete disappointment. When we reached the little house and peeked inside, we realized there was nothing in it. It seemed to be an altar. Empty, nothing more. The floor inside was just dirt, which seemed like an entrance to somewhere. Maybe a magical place. I did see the nuns passing in front of my house. Or at least a group of women in long dresses with their heads covered, who passed by twice in front of my house in the early morning. My older brother and I witnessed it. They walked towards the end of the street, and we assumed they would either go down the path or head to the large house at the end. From the first time we saw them, my brother became obsessed with finding out who they were. They made the dogs bark like crazy, but strangely they never woke my parents even though my mom was a light sleeper. The second time we saw them, my brother went out to the yard to see them up close. I followed a moment later when the dogs stopped barking, and my brother was still by the door looking outside. "Did you see them?" I asked. "I couldn't, they walked too fast," he replied as he opened the door. "What are you going to do?" I asked. "I'm going to the end of the street to see if I can catch them going down the hill." Before I could tell him it was a terrible idea, he ran out, barefoot and in pajamas. My chocolate-colored dog ran after him while I watched from the sidewalk, hoping they wouldn't wake my parents, but ready to scream for them if necessary. The night was clear enough with the full moon to see my brother at the end of the street. He peeked over the small wall, and from there he seemed to be watching with the dog beside him. Suddenly, Chocolate started barking desperately at something, and I only saw him run down the hill, followed by my brother shouting for him to come back. I lost sight of them for a few seconds. I froze for a moment, unsure whether to run after them or call my parents, but I snapped back when I saw my brother reappear on the street, carrying the dog almost as big as him, running desperately toward me. We rushed inside. He locked the door. He locked the house door and then our room door as well. He was sweating cold, and even the dog inside with us seemed very agitated. "They went into your little house," he said, referring to that small altar in the middle of the hill where not even a person could fit. "They all went in there. But an old man was outside as if guarding, and he saw Chocolate and me and yelled at us. It was then that our dog had barked, perhaps sensing the man's aggression, but my brother managed to stop him moments later. Years later, my brother recounted that one early morning he woke up because heard Chocolate. And he saw a woman in black like a nun. I grew up near the path known as the Bronco Cat, which eventually turned into a boulevard and is mentioned several times in the story. I remember not just when they found the body of one child but several at the time. Even during periods of heavy rain, that was a place where unfortunate victims from other areas, perhaps somewhat distant, ended up. Among the many paths leading down from the neighborhood to those ravines, a group of kids had built a hideout. It was a cave formed by several bushes and small trees that created a perfect circle. Very small but perfectly covered. Even as a child, you had to crawl in and stay hunched over inside. But that was what made it a perfect hiding spot. A friend, Chewy, invited me. He was one of those who had built that club, for lack of a better term. He had contributed things for others. That was the condition to enter. You had to contribute something, and then you could use it whenever you wanted as long as you didn't bring anyone unauthorized. The first time I brought some sodas, canned drinks and not much more. And then that day from among the bushes I saw a man. And as my friend pulled out some of the items someone else had shared, I saw a collection of loose magazine pages, some completely torn out and others just poorly cut fragments. They all showed naked women behind their folds and the ink was starting to fade. It was the first time I saw the female body in that way. It was fun. It was fun to go there. Tomas and Gabby were the oldest kids in the group. They were 12 years old and were the leaders and first founders of the club, of that hideout. But shortly after we stopped seeing Tomas. My friend Chewy said he had gone to the other side to the United States, but I never knew for sure. It was a very common step back then. One that almost everyone took. One that I ended up taking myself. Because today I'm writing to you from Oregon, where I've lived for over 2 decades. The little boy with slanted eyes, unfortunately I forgot his name. Christian I think he was called, but I couldn't be sure. He was the youngest in the club. Surely not even 8 years old. Ironically, he was the most interested in the photos of naked women. I had brought him some of my Justice League comics, but they didn't seem to interest him. And I remember that afternoon with total precision. I was playing soccer with the neighbors when, across the street, I saw the little boy with slanted eyes passing by, looking a bit rushed. I called out to him to ask where he was going, and he said he was headed to the club. I told him not to go alone, but he replied that Tomas had asked him to come. It took me a few seconds to react. Tomas hadn't been seen for months. So, I quickly went inside, called Chewy on the phone, and told him what I had just witnessed. He also found it odd but said he would check the club, which was very close to his house, as soon as he finished his homework. So I stopped worrying. I went back to finish the game and then headed home. The next day, all hell broke loose. Early in the morning, I received a call from Chewy. The little boy with slanted eyes hadn't been seen since the previous night. As soon as he realized they were searching for him everywhere, Chewy ran to the hideout to try and warn him that they were looking for him and to avoid a scolding, but when he arrived inside, in the darkness, a shape moved quickly. Something much larger than the little boy. A black shape. Undoubtedly an adult. Fearing the worst, he approached. He got as close as he could to the entrance but saw nothing but darkness. He picked up a stone nearby and threw it inside. And then he saw them move. There. 3 large, completely dark shapes. As if they were dressed in black. As if they were completely covered. He ran home and knew he would have to sacrifice the secret. He told his parents about the club and what he had just seen, that they couldn't find a child. They quickly contacted the little boy's parents, and along with several neighbors, they went to search that hideout in the ravine. They found nothing. Not the hideout nor the items we had brought there. But it was clear that the largest bush that served as the roof for the entire hideout had been recently uprooted. Nonetheless, they didn't believe Chewy much. On Monday at school, another kid who had just joined the club approached us, and whose name I also don't remember because we only exchanged words 2 or 3 times. According to him, he had seen from his window how that night a group of women descended one of the paths towards the ravine. What caught his attention was that among them was the silhouette of a small child. We could never confirm that it was the little boy with slanted eyes, although we shared this with his parents. And of him, nothing was ever heard again. When I left the place, the neighborhood, his parents were still living in the same house. In total and permanent sadness since the disappearance of their son. To the church mentioned in the story religiously every Sunday with my whole family. For some reason, it made me a bit uncomfortable and I was afraid of it since I can remember. Even more so, the nuns who were always around. My siblings noticed and told me I shouldn't be afraid of them, but of those who had left. I remember that, as always, I didn't pay much attention to them, but they kept the story going. I thought they were making up more and more details to scare me. They mentioned that a nun was continuously seen on the church roof at night. Eventually, the neighbors discussed it with the priest, asking if it was normal or if the woman was sick. It was a macabre sight for those who had to pass by that street early in the morning. They noticed a nun peeking from the bell tower to watch them. The issue wasn't resolved, but it did draw the community's attention, especially the priests, to what was happening at the convent in the early hours. They say the priest, the sacristan, and the Mother Superior devised a plan to discover which of the nuns had that strange habit. They feared nothing bad or unusual, but perhaps the sleepwalking of a sick woman or imbalances caused by an illness that could endanger her. One early morning, they noticed a nun leaving the convent and entering the church very stealthily. They thought they had found the woman who went to the bell tower. But this nun left a few minutes later with a container of holy water and then headed to the street. From a good distance, the 3 followed her until they lost her at a street corner. They walked quietly and tried to guess where she had gone. Then, the reflection of a fire lighting up against a wall revealed several shadows. They appeared to be dancing inside one of the houses. They approached and noticed the house seemed uninhabited for years, but at that moment, there were definitely people inside. Thinking the nun might be in danger, they entered and what they discovered horrified them. Around the fire, 7 women danced, all dressed in clothing. 2 of them were in nun habits but with different attire. 2 were undoubtedly from that convent, but the other 5 were complete strangers. They danced in such a way that it became clear that, beneath their habits, their bodies were naked. In the background, amidst symbols they clearly identified as demonic, a child, a very blonde child, watched the scene terrified. Something made the 3 witnesses feel a deep fear. They rushed out to call the other sisters, the police, and trusted members of the small community of that time. Although it took just 2 or 3 minutes, the man returned alone to find the place empty. The fire was extinguished and the figures were gone. The child and the women had vanished without a trace. It was as if nothing had ever happened there. The police searched the area, but there were no signs of anyone being there. The incident became a whispered legend among the locals, a story that was shared but never confirmed. The priest and those who witnessed the scene were left with an unsettling feeling, a mystery that would never be solved. Over time, the memory of that night faded, blending into the fabric of other tales and rumors that surrounded the neighborhood. Yet, for those who knew the story, it remained a chilling reminder of the unknown lurking in the shadows, a testament to the eerie events that sometimes unfold beyond the veil of everyday life.